Verlin Kruger, a plumbing contractor from DeWitt, Michigan, 49 years old and a solid family man with 9 children. Clint Waddell, a U.S. Forestry Service biologist from St. Paul, Minnesota, 36 years old and a bachelor. But these two men had one abiding interest in common: the thrill of canoeing wilderness waters. Clint and Verlin first teamed up for a professional canoe race back in 1966. In '68, they made a record-breaking endurance run of 250 miles in 81 hours from International Falls, Minnesota to Grand Portage on Lake Superior. But now, they are to undertake an incredible challenge, never before attempted by two men in a canoe. Clint and Verlin had long been intrigued by the history of the French-Canadian voyageurs. These early trappers, traders, and explorers used canoes as the sole means of penetrating the Canadian wilderness. Each spring, large Montreal canoes like this, each carrying as much as 3 tons, plus crew and supplies, would leave Montreal for an 8-week journey to the settlement of Grand Portage on a shallow bay of Lake Superior. There they would rendezvous with the smaller north canoes used by the trappers to return from their winter trapping grounds. These would be loaded primarily with beaver pelts, then in great demand in the fashion centers of Europe. The smaller north canoes were ideally suited to the swift waters of rivers such as the Athabasca. The flotillas of Montreal and north canoes would meet at Grand Portage in late June, and the rendezvous would last a full month. There would be storytelling and shooting matches, canoe races, and of course, trading. The trappers would trade their beaver pelts for the wares brought up from Montreal: guns, ammunition, cloth, tools, traps, and food to vary their wilderness diets. Not to mention tobacco and spirited beverages and trade goods for the Indians. It's an historical fact that by the mid-1700s, these trappers and traders had worked out a transportation system which spanned over 3,000 miles of Canadian waters, from Montreal to the tiny settlement of Fort Chipewyan on Lake Athabasca. They accomplished this with the birch bark canoe as their only vehicle. There were no roads other than game trails, and so the rivers and lakes were the highways of the wilderness, and canoes were the cars and trucks. Small trading posts were established at key points throughout this transportation network, but the big business of the year was transacted at the rendezvous, the midway point in that wilderness network. And each canoe brigade traveled 3,000 miles in getting to that rendezvous, and then back to their starting points in the course of some 4 months. But there's no record anywhere of anyone taking a canoe completely across the continent and up to the Bering Sea in one trip, from spring to fall. Could the voyageurs have done it? Could anyone do it? Clint and Verlin found themselves asking that question with ever-increasing fascination. Could they make a trip that not even the voyageurs had attempted? True, it was now 300 years since the days when Montreal was just a village, but much of the route is still virtually unchanged from the time of the voyageurs. Clint and Verlin had no choice. They just had to give it a go. This is the challenge they face: to traverse this continent by canoe through some of the wildest country it contains. They decided to leave Montreal in mid-April, just after the spring thaw, when the river ice would be breaking up. They would head upstream on the St. Lawrence River, transfer to the Ottawa River, and head across the northern shore of Lake Huron. Portaging the Soo Locks, the two would cross the northern shore of Lake Superior, 470-some miles into the boundary waters of Minnesota. Then paddle across rugged Lake Winnipeg to the Churchill River chain of lakes and into the Clearwater River of the Arctic watershed. From there, down the Athabasca River across the west end of Lake Athabasca to Fort Chipewyan. That's where the main fur trade route ended. But Kruger and Waddell were going farther yet. They would take their canoe down the treacherous Slave River through the Great Slave Lake to reach the majestic Mackenzie River, which was discovered by explorer Sir Alexander Mackenzie in 1789. Then travel the twisted, shallow waters of the Rat River and labor up the steep climb to the McDougall Pass of the Richardson Mountains, the northern end of the Rockies. After crossing Summit Lake on top of the mountains, they would join up with the Yukon River in Alaska, a mere 1,200 miles from the Bering Sea. A newspaper account of this unbelievable endeavor fails to mention Verlin Kruger's 3 years of meticulous research. He read literally every appropriate book written, even going so far as to obtain microfilm copies of the journal kept by Alexander Mackenzie. Kruger designed and built the 21-foot-long, 110-pound fiberglass Sitka spruce canoe, and he used sections of a pole vaulter's pole as shafts for the specially built paddle blades. The enormity of this voyage almost defies comprehension. If they were to travel the same distance in the United States, they would begin in New York and paddle straight across America to California, then turn around and paddle back to New York, and then again paddle back to California, over 7,000 miles. As they pull away from land, Kruger knows that battling the natural elements will be only a part of the challenge. His extensive research has shown that psychological tension is always a greater threat than wind, weather, or stream conditions. Other attempts of this magnitude failed when the paddlers could no longer tolerate the close presence of each other for days, weeks, and months on end. The immediate problem, however, is ice. For the last 94 years, the St. Lawrence River has usually been free of ice by the 10th of April. It is now April 17th, but the river is still frozen, with about a foot of slush on top of the ice. It is impossible to walk through it or slide the canoe over it. After testing the ice, Verlin thinks the only solution is to portage. You can see that Clint is thrilled to death about that. To carry canoe and all gear over land to open water. Since they have no choice, it's full speed astern as the search for the portage begins. Clint had trained for portaging by gathering 200 pounds of neighborhood children and carrying them on his back for hours. Verlin had spent the winter carrying the canoe around a 2-mile course in DeWitt, Michigan. But they'd not expected to be portaging so soon. Verlin's reactions are recorded in his diary.
I never in my wildest imagination figured on portaging 30 or 40 or 50 miles right out of town, right up the river. I find it hard to believe myself that this is a canoe trip.
The men are carrying approximately 170 pounds each, and they will carry those loads 47 miles on this portage alone. Putting the canoe down by open water 4 days later is more than just mild relief, and Verlin records his reactions.
Man, oh man, you have to do it to understand the thrill and joy of putting that canoe down after hours and hours of sweat and pain. That's one of the supreme joys of the trip. You know, it's funny. We look forward to getting out of the canoe to make a portage, but after the portage, nothing was better than getting back into the canoe.
Berlin and Clint use the standard canoe racer's paddle stroke, 50 to 55 per minute. But even these powerful racing strokes require efficient hull design for best results. Berlin's design assures a maximum glide with each stroke of the special paddles. Now, should they complete their epic journey, these paddles will pull through Canadian waters more than 5 million times. As they thread their way through oncoming chunks of ice, the feeling is one of anxiety laced with exhilaration. Priorities change rapidly when man faces nature. Gasoline prices and credit cards and tax forms become pretty hollow words when a man feels himself once more the captain of his soul. Heroism flows from the successful meeting of challenges within challenges, and you're watching a plumber and a biologist challenge history. You see two men in a homemade canoe, two men whose teamwork approaches the grace of a ballet, and whose courage tells you that they need never fear that they may cease to be. The next 3 days, the two paddle over 30 miles a day against the brisk current of the Ottawa River before they pass by the Canadian Parliament buildings in the city of Ottawa. Did some desk-bound bureaucrat, I wonder, spot them from a window and say, "Look at those two nuts in the canoe down there"? And if so, what would he have said if he had known what they were setting out to accomplish? But for now, the paddling is halted again. There are still many more miles of back-breaking, monotonous portaging through the busy streets of Canada's capital. In a series of cannon-like roars, spring comes to the Canadian waters, and the ice breaks up in the Ottawa River. As usual, opportunity is coupled with danger. The current alone at nearly 5 miles an hour against them would be bad enough. Add the hazard of floating ice, and matters get much worse. As the river roars by them, the weight and size of the canoe actually begins to put a curve in Berlin Kruger's back on the long portages. As he wrote in his diary,
"So great was the weight of the canoe on these long days that when I would lie on my back to rest, it would take 5 minutes before my cramped muscles could relax enough to let my head and my heels touch the ground at the same time. The pain was something to remember."
But the portaging goes on as they search for a place that will enable them to put the canoe in the water and get out into the river. With the exception of hydroelectric dams like this, much of the route taken by the voyageurs remains virtually unchanged after hundreds of years. Many Canadians are keenly aware of their historical heritage and realize that these same rivers and elements confronted the voyageurs in their quest for more and more furs. On April 30th, the two go ashore at the confluence of the Ottawa and Mattawa rivers, 13 days after their departure from Lachine. Though they set out as two men trying to conquer a continent, they realize that it, in its own way, is conquering them. The Voyageur mystique has begun to work its subtle magic. Verlin works on his diary as they stop in Champlain Provincial Park for several days. Again, the lake ahead of them is frozen. Clint leaves, beginning a pattern of deliberate separation at the noon meal, designed to alleviate as much as possible any tension building up between them. His explorations lead him to another link with the past, a beaver pond. The beaver became the rage of European hatters centuries ago because of a unique quality of its pelt. The hair of the beaver is minutely barbed. When put under pressure in the felting process and stiffened with shellac, it could be molded into any shape required by the hat fashions of the day. Though demand for the beaver pelts has never again approached that of the 17 and 1800s, there's still a brisk trade in the skins, and people like Andy Green here, repositories of both a trade and a cultural heritage at the same time, have no trouble at all selling a properly prepared pelt. And here Andy's heritage serves him well, for the baiting and placing of traps is all important and no matter to be left to an amateur. When Andy catches a beaver, he prepares the hide for market by stretching it on this old Indian invention, a Cree hoop. Over $3 million worth of beaver pelts are still taken out of the province of Ontario each year. A pelt of this size and quality will bring Andy Green about $50 at one of the many fur auctions in Canada. Here, Verlin and Clint touch the fascinating Voyageur past again in the person of Charlie Labarge, the chief ranger at the park. Charlie is a descendant of one of the original French-Canadian voyageurs, and he keeps his heritage alive by building birch bark canoes, the same way they were built back in the 1700s. The black lines on this model canoe show where the birch bark has been caulked with spruce and pine gum to prevent leaking. A large Montreal canoe carried a fantastic payload of 4 tons, all in a fragile birch bark skin. Early in the spring, Charlie finds a large birch bark tree. Just as you see him doing here, carefully removes the bark. Incidentally, this doesn't harm or kill the tree. The Indians made the first birch bark canoes and constructed them without using any metal or steel tools. Eric Morse, a well-known Canadian author and fur trade historian, claims that each canoe carried its spare parts, extra bark, gum, and cedar or spruce roots in a roll of birch bark like this. Alexander Mackenzie's journal of Friday, July 28, 1793, recounts the same problems that faced Charlie Labarge and his helpers. Mackenzie must build a canoe, and men are dispatched to gather the necessary materials.
At a very early hour of the morning,
Mackenzie wrote,
every man was employed in making preparations for building another canoe, and different parties went in search of birch bark, roots, and gum.
Charlie Labarge will use the same materials. The roots of a spruce tree will be treated to make them soft and pliable. Charlie gathers pitch, or gum, from spruce trees which is used to plug up the many small holes in the canoe. It takes Charlie and his helper nearly 300 hours of painstaking work to build a 16-foot-long canoe. Like many before it, this one may find itself gracing one of Canada's many fine museums. Charlie explains to Clint and Verlin that his motivation to build these canoes is a purely historical one. Charlie says that perhaps someone from a future generation may see one of his canoes in a museum and possibly gain a little insight into his heritage. After several days of rain, portages along the rocky and rugged Mattawa River are wet and muddy. But in keeping with the spirit of their trip, they accept no help from anyone, use no motors or tow vehicles, and whenever possible, they single portage all their gear. This means just one trip, hauling everything at once. In this case, however, the rugged terrain forced them to make 2 trips, or double portage. And now it's time to leave. And it's evident Charlie would like to go along with them, but it's only a 2-man canoe. So they paddle on, sometimes going faster backwards than forward, since in spots the current is nearly 15 miles an hour against them. Even the river bank itself often functions as a history book. Verlin and Clint slow down as they pass this cave. Early voyageurs were very superstitious, and they believed the devil himself lurked in this sinister-looking den on the Mattawa River. They would paddle past it as quickly as they could manage, giving the shoreline a mighty wide berth. Clint and Verlin struggle upstream, and an ominous roar tells them that another portage is at hand. The source of that roar tells them why. As the paddlers push farther into Canada's wilderness, the terrain becomes more ruggedly beautiful. This is the same scenery that greeted Samuel de Champlain more than 3.5 centuries ago. But now it's time to portage again. Clint and Verlin decide to take a look at what lies ahead. Every explorer, voyageur, or missionary who canoed up into the Great Lakes area had to portage here. The rocks are worn smooth from many years of usage, and they prove that Verlin and Clint are on the Fur Route Trail. Below, the rapids, and Clint says that the 2 can't paddle through them. They must portage. Verlin wonders. He thinks maybe they can make it. Clint's answer? No way. They hike back down to their canoe for the inevitable portage. Yep, tote that canoe, Verlin. This time the slippery rocks make it impossible for one man to carry the canoe by himself, and so they double haul their gear. Paddling with the synchronized grace of true professionals, Clint and Verlin resume their quest in beautiful weather. You'd have to feel the power of your own arms pulling the canoe, hear the lapping of the water against the hull, and share the feeling that you belong exactly where you are to know what this voyage means to these men. Before it's over, exhilaration will become mixed with great physical pain. On more than one occasion, they will paddle all night, and at least 6 times they will paddle a minimum of 40 consecutive hours, stopping only for meals and 10-minute rest breaks.